When did the West lose its common sense? Why do top academics still insist on calling Islam a religion of peace? Can we still rescue academia from the woke takeover? And perhaps the biggest question of them all, how has Professor Gad Saad dodged cancel culture after openly mocking wokeness and postmodernism? Hello, everyone. I'm Matan Hasidim, and welcome to the Spirit of the Times podcast. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with one of the most influential public intellectuals of our time, Professor Gad Saad, which today he is a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University. Gad, welcome.
מה שלומך?
שלומי מצוין. Next time we're going to do maybe a podcast in Hebrew, but actually we're doing this podcast today uh, for your book, The Parasitic Mind, How Infections Ideas are killing the common sense. It's now available on Hebrew. זה בהוצאת שיבולת, פרזיטים, כיצד איבד המערב את ההיגיון הבריא. So I just tested your Hebrew. So we have a lot to unpack today, really. I have a lot of questions for you. So let's start from maybe October 7th before getting to all the parasites that you write about. 5 years ago, calling the West in decline seemed maybe quite extreme. But now, with October 7th, I think that things have changed. I think that October 7th played a significant role in revealing the extent to which these parasites that we're going to talk about have infiltrated the West. How you view those events?
Look, October 7 crystallized, the departure from reason for many people, but I hate to say it, we didn't need October 7th for that realization to come true, right? I've been standing on top of the mountain for my entire academic career, screaming into the wind, most people ignoring me, saying, this is coming. So it is regrettable that it takes such orgiastic tragedies like October 7th to get some people to wake up. But really, the problem has been festering for much, much longer than October 7th.
But do you agree that October 7th actually, manifested something bigger that happening in universities? Now, as Douglas Murray said it, we know everyone where it's holds, Nobody can pretend anymore.
Yes. Look, my home university, which is Concordia University in Montreal, has been called colloquially as Hamas University and Gaza University for many decades, right? Benjamin Netanyahu was canceled in 2002 from coming to Concordia University. So again, from speaking at Concordia University. So again, yes, you're right that the assortment of people's positions is much clearer once October 7th happened. But believe me, this problem has been going on for much, much longer. So, example, and we may get into this later in greater detail, my life trajectory is one that precedes October 7th by nearly 50 years, right? We had to escape Lebanon under the imminent threat of execution as the last remaining, Lebanese Jews. So October 7th is only a surprise to those who had their head in the proverbial sand. That's why in the parasitic mind, I talk about ostrich parasitic syndrome, right? Because the
We're gonna
ostrich.
talk about it, about the ostrich
Okay, so
parasitic syndrome, yeah.
I'll hold off to that. Yeah. So go ahead.
Okay, so because you're such a prophet, I'm kidding, you're on the right side of, of history, maybe we can say it like that. So in an interview I did with Melanie Phillips, I mentioned a tweet of yours from when there were riots in England that took place in July, I think, where you said that the war in Europe with Muslims is coming and probably it's inevitable. Do you still think this is the case? Do you think it's possible to prevent it from reaching to that point?
If we stay on the current track, it's a 100% guarantee. It is as clear as you jumping off a building and checking what the effects of gravity will be. It's as clear as that. Because look, ideas have consequences. Islam is a set of codified ideas. There's only one of three things that Islam can do. It can either promote individual liberties and freedoms, it could not affect individual liberties and freedoms, or it could reduce individual liberties and freedom. There isn't a fourth option, right? And so once you put Islam with Western traditions, they can't coexist. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't find endless cases in history where Muslims and non-Muslims did not coexist for a period, but that period eventually is no longer peaceful, right? So it's kind of like arguing, how could this guy have gotten a heart attack and died? Because every single day prior to him having the heart attack, he was living and he was walking and jogging. Well, yes, but there was stuff that was happening in the background that eventually led to the heart attack. That's what happens with Islam, especially when it mixes with values that are perfectly antithetical to those of Islam. So it is absolutely unequivocal that if the current trends continue, there will be massive violence in Europe, but not only in Europe, everywhere where these realities are taking place, right? The demography is destiny is truly the most fundamental prediction of how a society goes. With greater Islam, there'll be fewer liberties, and either the Europeans will wake up or else they will become Islamized, like the 56 other countries that are currently part of the OIC.
You know what's great? From my experience talking to Middle East scholars, the issue of many academics face, when not all of them are on the left or woke, is that the academic method, which focuses on many details, often prevents them from making a strong, clear statements and, viewing the big picture. So, for example, when discussing Islam, I often hear Islam is no is so diverse. How can you talk about it as a one thing, Or the Islam of Spain's golden age was different, or a one that is very popular in Israel. I don't know if you've heard about it before. Can we really call the Shiite ideology behind the Iranian regime authentic Shiite Islam? Like, of course, those scholars would say, yeah, of course, it's Khomeini is evil and it's terrible and everything. But Khomeini incorporated Marxist ideas into traditional Shia Islam. So, it's not the authentic Shia Islam. How do you respond to this kind of argument?
Yeah, I respond to it in chapter 6 of the Parasitic Mind, where I do talk about ostrich parasitic syndrome. So this is a cognitive bias known as the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? So Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the leading Sunni Islamic cleric of Islam, from Al Azhar University, according to some of your academic colleagues, doesn't represent true Islam. So, the leading Sunni cleric at the leading Islamic university in the world doesn't represent true Islam. What does represent true Islam is your friend Ahmad, who is gay, eats prosciutto, and drinks vodka. He's the true representative of Islam. But Khomeini is not, the Saudi clerics are not, ISIS is not, Muhammad is not, Muhammad's companions are not. So we can keep saying no true Islam until we find one that caters to our Western sensibilities. He must be true Islam.
So, another question about Islam, as an evolutionary psychologist, how do you explain the fact that societies adopting Islam often fall into, of course, I'm not talking about every Muslim and Muslim, I have Muslim friends, but I'm talking about societies in large, in general. So they fall into ignorance, into poverty, stagnation, violence, things that are not beneficial from a survival standpoint. And yet, many people continue to hold on to and embrace Islam. How do you explain this?
So there are several ways to answer this. One of which is that one of the beautiful things about most religions is that it cures our mortality problem, right? So I just have to swallow whichever preferred religion I have, and then suddenly I become immortal. So remember that under Islam, there is an afterlife that is actually much more glorious than the current life. So viewed from that perspective, once I am parasitized by this eternal utopia, then the fact that something bad happens within this earthly realm does not mean that this will bring about my death, because the real life begins after my current material death. And so there are many ways by which you could explain how Islam can flourish from a Darwinian perspective. As a matter of fact, one of the truly incredibly successful elements of Islam, if we are to use a evolutionary and Darwinian mechanism, is that the memeplex of Islam. So just let me explain it for your listeners and viewers. A meme, now everybody
That
knows the
haven't read Richard Dawkins, yeah.
exactly. So Richard Dawkins in his 1976 Selfish Gene book talked about the fact that, correctly so, that humans are both a biological and a cultural animal. Our genes spread and propagate, but so do our memes. Memes are any ideas, beliefs, jingles, songs, religions that spread from one brain to another. And so you can measure the mimetic, uh, infectious score of a particular set of memeplexes. A memeplex is just a collection of memes. So Judaism is a memeplex. Christianity is a memeplex. Islam is a memeplex. Now, Judaism is a profoundly non-successful memeplex. So, or to use marketing terms, it's terrible in its marketing abilities. Why? Because if you're trying to attract customers, then Judaism seems to never increase. We're currently at around 15 million with no signs of improvement. Why? Because it's not a proselytizing religion. You're not meant to convert others. If anything, if people try to convert to Judaism, you're supposed to dissuade them. You're supposed to make it as difficult for them as possible. That's not a very smart marketing tactic if you're trying to bring people into your quote product. Islam, on the other hand, its memeplex is structured in such a way that it is, evolutionarily speaking, profoundly successful. Hence, why 1/4 of humanity, roughly 1.7, 1.8 billion people, a bit less than 1/4 of humanity is Islamic. And there are specific contents within Islam that allow that. I'll just mention one. Islam is the most proselytizing of all religions, even more so than Christianity. Islam does purport that there will be peace on earth once every single person on earth is united under the unifying flag of Allah. So that is the goal, and that's why Islam spreads. Islam only requires a single sentence, the Shahada, that is proclaimed publicly and openly with witnesses, and voila, you become Muslim. It takes a lot more to become Jewish. That's why you got 15 million Jews
Hmm.
and 125 times as many Muslims.
So the question is not about Islam, it was supposed to be about Judaism, you know? And
Well,
even what you said about afterlife, I don't think that we can apply to Judaism because
true.
afterlife is not really um, in the main religious practical thought of Judaism. Maybe
Well,
you'd like to.
that's what I said when I was answering you. I said that the answer that I'm giving doesn't cover all possibilities because why do Jews support Islam the way that they do is a different explanation that does not rely on the afterlife. Which, if you want, I can. Do you want me to get into why
Yeah,
some?
it's interesting. Yeah, of course.
There are again several possible explanations. I'll give one from my neuroparasitological framework. You may have heard me mention this before, maybe not, but certainly your viewers may not have. Neuroparasitology is the field that seeks to understand the interaction between parasites and hosts, which happen in countless ways in the animal kingdom. A neuroparasite is different from just a regular parasite in that it seeks to, as its final destination, go to the host's brain, altering its circuitry to suit the interest, typically the reproductive interest of the parasite. So a tapeworm is a parasite, but it goes into your intestinal tract. A neuroparasite wants to go to your mind. Hence, that's why I use that framework to explain idea pathogens. Now, I'm going to come to the Jewish uh, parasitized people in a second. The wood cricket is one type of animal that is parasitized. It hates water. The wood cricket doesn't want to do anything with water. But when it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water in order to complete its reproductive cycle. So once the hapless zombified wood cricket is parasitized, it happily and merrily jumps into the water, commits suicide in the service of the parasite. So many parasitized Jews are just two-legged versions of wood crickets because they think they are, and again, there are several reasons for that. So, for example, if you are Jewish from a land where Islam ruled, hence you're a dhimmi. A dhimmi is a not even second class, third class, fourth class citizen under Islamic law, whereby you are tolerated until you're not tolerated. Well, if I'm a dhimmi, I develop the psychology of servitude, right? I want to demonstrate respect, great respect and reverence to my overlords because they know I know that at any minute, if any one of them notices that my daughter is really pretty, then I'm in trouble, right? And therefore, there is an appeasement strategy of wood cricket Jews under Islamic lands that causes them to say, no, Islam is beautiful, it's gorgeous. Now, what about Western Jews? Well, Western Jews have also had to be at the forefront of fighting for civil rights and so on, right? So, for example, many of the uh, leading civil rights activists in the civil rights movements in the United States were, of course, either black or many of them were Jewish because Jews come from a history of bigotry. And so, what better way to demonstrate that you're against all forms of bigotry? So, take that idea and now apply it to Islam. It feels wrong for me if I am a Harvard Jew uh, to say that Islam is bad because I have a lot of friends, Ahmad, Mahmoud, Muhammad, who've never killed anybody, who are perfectly lovely. And I sat at the dinner table at my home in Boston with my super progressive Jewish wood cricket family members who always said that all Muslims are lovely and kind. So it feels gauche, it feels wrong for me to criticize it. So there are different reasons why wood cricket Jews would be in love with Islam. But of course, they are all fools because none of them would have been saved had they found their way at the Nova Film Festival. They would have gotten the exact same bullet, whether they were Gabor Mate, who really loves Palestinians, or not. They would have ended up in the exact same place.
Yes. Would it be fair to say that today you are Jewish observant? Like you have a strong Jewish identity, you don't eat pork, for example, but you're not religious by any means.
So it depends how you define the term religious, right? If you mean am I wedded to my Jewish identity, then short of Maimonides, there's nobody more Jewish than me. If it means I better head home on Friday and light the candle at 4:21 because the Chabad rabbi said it's 4:21, but 4:22 is a really big problem to Adonai, then no, I'm not very religious. So remember that Judaism is a multifaceted construct. It is a shared people, it's a shared lineage, it's a shared history. So, from that perspective, I'm incredibly Jewish. From the everyday rituals, do I think it is a mortal sin to eat shrimp soup? No, I don't.
Well, not everyday practice, but from the perspective, I think that a lot of observant Jews would say today, if I'm gonna ask them if you're, practice Judaism. So, it's like one person, he believes in God, he prays, maybe.
Look, 2 weeks ago was my son's bar mitzvah. We had the bar mitzvah in a very serious way. He had to read from the Torah. I put on my tefillin. So, am I Rabbi Schneerson? No. Am I? Look, I lived my Judaism more than most Jews will ever live because I had to wear some really good running shoes and outrun those who were going to behead me, right?
Mhm.
That's it. Mic drop. I've done my part. And what I do every day for Judaism makes me a lot more Jewish than whether I eat shrimp or not. So
Yeah, no,
that's
I ask just because when I hear your talks and I hear you about speaking about religion, so you speak a little bit like a new atheist, like it's like listening to Sam Harris a little bit. You can understand me?
except that I'm not I don't like the term new atheist. It's a silly term, but I'm not hostile to religion and certainly not to Judaism as long as it doesn't infringe on scientific truths. In other words, uh, as an evolutionary psychologist, I actually have written about the evolutionary roots of belief and of religion. In other words, it makes a lot more evolutionary sense to be a believer than to be an atheist because to be a believer allows me to get through some very, very dark realities in my existence, right? If your 4-year-old son, God forbid, is stricken with leukemia, it's a lot more comforting to wed that reality to a religious narrative than it is to say, bad stuff happens. Sorry, Timmy. I guess you got leukemia.
It's comforting, but it doesn't say that there is really a God that you pray. I mean, he can, hear you listening to your prayers, and you know what I
Yes,
mean?
exactly. But well, Blaise Pascal said this, the philosopher, when he offered his explanation for why people should believe. I mean, he didn't use the term utilitarian and so on, but he basically created a game theoretic model. You can believe in God or not, and he could exist or not. So it's a two by two matrix. And now the idea is that under all scenarios, it makes more sense to believe in God. So I understand the reflex to believe, but for example, if a rabbi were to say to me, as many have, uh, how could you believe in evolution? We know that that's not the thing. Now I have a problem because uh, you are pitting a religious narrative against an incontrovertible theory that has about 150 years of incontrovertible evidence. We build drugs, medicine, based on evolutionary theory, not by looking at a particular code in the Torah, right? So religion is wonderful because it weds us to a shared narrative, and there are, as I said, many functional values to religion. My only problem with religion is once it becomes arrogant enough to offer a narrative that contradicts science. So, Stephen Jay Gould, for example, although I don't agree with his position, was what's called a proponent of the NOMA principle. NOMA stands for non overlapping magisteria, meaning that he was saying, look, religion can exist in this space and science can exist in this space. And as long as they don't infringe on each other, they don't overlap, then I think there is room for both. And to that extent, I agree with him. The problem is if I am a young earth creationist, I absolutely and literally believe that the earth is a couple of several thousand years old, and the average 3-day old squirrel who studied geology knows that to not be true. So that's my only problem. So I'm not a new atheist. I'm not hostile to religion. I just wish that religion would worry about our uh, moral and spiritual
Yeah,
value
of
and
course.
leave the science for others.
Of course, I think that the one who wrote a better book than Stephen Jay Gould was actually the Rabbi and the Lord Jonathan Sachs, The Big Partnership. He actually wrote something similar to Jay Gould, but I think in a maybe a better way.
Well,
So
thank you for telling me that because I don't think I've read that, so I'll have to read that.
yeah, it's a great book, great book. I think it was his best book by Rabbi Sachs. So you explained briefly about the parasites and how it connect to bad ideas. Can you explain more about how they are destroying the West common sense today?
Right. So let me go back to the start of how I first realized that there were these flourishing parasites on university campuses. So my area of scientific research is largely at the intersection of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology and applying it to human behavior in general and economic behavior and consumer behavior in particular. So I study the biological fundamental underpinnings of why we do the things that we do. Okay. Now, to me, that seems obvious, right? It can't be that you study every single species on Earth while invoking that species' biological heritage, but there is only one species called Homo sapiens that somehow exists outside the realm of biology. Or if biology applies to Homo sapiens, it applies, but as long as it stops at the neck. So evolution can explain why we have opposable thumbs. That's okay. Evolution explains why our liver works the way that it does. That's okay. But surely, Professor Saad, you're not one of those Nazi professors who thinks that the human mind
Jewish
might
Nazi. Jewish
Jewish
Nazi.
Nazi, exactly, might have evolved through that human mind might have evolved through a process that is akin to every other species that has ever existed on Earth. So that's when I first saw how could my colleagues be such imbeciles? How could it be controversial for the colleagues that I have, very smart people, economists and organizational psychologists and consumer psychologists and psychologists of decision making and operations researchers and behavioral finance folks, all of these guys with huge degrees and super smart, suddenly were unwilling to accept the fact that biology matters in explaining human behavior. So that was my first exposure 30 plus years ago to the fact that very intelligent people could be fully parasitized by imbecility. And then subsequently, over the next 30 years of my career, I experienced that with increasing frequency. And so I tell very early at the start of The Parasitic Mind that I have faced two great wars in my life. First, the Lebanese Civil War, and two, the war on reason, science, logic, common sense, reality on university campuses. So what the book does is it basically traces many of these parasitic ideas, and I'll explain a few in a second. And then towards the end of the book, I offer a vaccine, an inoculation against these bad ideas. So let me start with, as I call it, the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas, postmodernism. Postmodernism purports that there are no universal truths other than the one universal truth that there are no universal truths. So already it completely crumbles, but let's not let logic get in the way of our stupidity. And so postmodernism becomes a form of intellectual terrorism, as I call it, or nihilism, because up could be down, left is right, men are women, slavery is freedom, peace is war. There are no objective truths to speak of. So it is that framework that then allows a lot of the other nonsense to flourish. So transgender activism could not have flourished were it not that I am afforded that ability through postmodernism, because postmodernism says it is not true that there are only two sexes in a sexually reproducing species made up of the male and female phenotype. No, sex is on a spectrum, right? So this is like arguing, as I explained, that it is not true that human beings have, as part of their fixed traits, 10 fingers, because my cousin Frank was born with a congenital condition with 11 fingers, and so fingers come on a continuum. Some have 7, some have 11, and so on. So that parasitic idea then allows all the other ones to flourish. What are some of the other ones? Social constructivism is a parasitic idea. All human phenomena construction. There are no biological imperatives. Here's another one: cultural relativism. Who are you to judge the beliefs, the practices of another culture? If another culture decides that they wish to cut off the clitorises of 5-year-old girls, don't be a cultural imperialist and use your cultural reference points to judge others. You have no right to do so. So there are no moral truths, there are no aesthetic truths, there are no epistemological truths, there are no musical truths, right? So if I just start slamming and make noise, who are you to argue that that's not its own form of brilliant music? Who are you to say that an empty canvas that is sitting at the Carnegie Museum is itself not a form of beautiful art? By the way, I tell that story in the book where I had gone to visit a friend at Carnegie Mellon University in 1996, and I visited the Carnegie Museum. I paid money to see art, and then I am witnessing an empty canvas. And so I demanded to see the curator of the museum. They ended up sending someone else to see me, asked me how can she help me? And I said, well, why is there an empty canvas here? And then, of course, she answered, well, you see, it is causing us to have a wonderful conversation. So that's the value of it. And so that's what you get with all of these parasitic ideas. It's an attack on human reason. And that's why we ended up in the place where we are today.
Okay, so that was a great summary. You need to read the book, of course. It's not, uh, but I want to say like, person like me. So I'm a conservative. I have a nice kippah. I listened to Dennis Prager and Jordan Peterson for years. So I read your book, and I'm biased. Before our conversation, I took this book. I gave it to a progressive woman student that I know. And she didn't really like it. Okay,
Yeah.
let's say it like that. Um, so the question is, your book, when you wrote it, you tried to convince the other side, like the woke students who are gonna open it, or are you saying, okay, if someone is on the woke side, it's over?
Look, the regrettable part is that the people who most should be reading the book are precisely those like your wood cricket friend who say no, 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 la la la, I don't want to hear it, right? Uh, but
I don't think she even read it all the book.
I'm sure she didn't. But listen, I'm optimistic by nature. I believe that most people are reachable. Now, there are some that are absolutely unreachable no matter what I might present to them. And so, one of the skills that you have to develop if you are in the business of trying to change people's minds is to know how to allocate your time strategically. If that's one of the reasons why, by the way, I refuse many, many invitations to debate people, not because boo hoo hoo, I'm scared to debate them. I could have debated them when I was 6 years old. The problem is, I know that there is nothing that I could ever say that could cause them to even have a modicum of intellectual humility to say, that's interesting. I'd never thought of it, right? So they come with their revealed truths, and then it's la la la, and then they scream over you. And so there's no point in me engaging it because I know it's going to be a waste of time. But I would like to think that most people are not as dogmatic as that, and so that with enough time, they will change their position. And if I may, I can give you one of a million such examples right now. And actually, I discuss this case in the Parasitic Mind, but then the finale of that story only happened a year ago. After I had, of course, written the Parasitic Mind.
It's the
So
girlfriend of your student that came to the.
no, no, no. That's another good one. Although I never spoke to the girlfriend of my student, although I can
Okay.
tell you that story, which has become a
Because this
very
could have been, wow, it could have been a shock.
no, no. That I wish I could tell you that I was able to flip her, but I never spoke to her after that evening. Although I'm still very much in touch with the
The
student
student. Yeah.
who's now become himself a professor. Uh, No, this is the story of a woman who, I think it was 2010, if I'm not mistaken, had written to me saying she's Jewish, by the way, and she has grandparents who, were in the Holocaust. So you would think she would be open to not being a wood cricket, but she wasn't. Uh, so she reached out to me and said, I am friends with a Muslim PhD student who's studying Islamic theology and so on for a PhD. And she told me that no, 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 Islam is absolutely in love with the Jews. Now, I know you're Arabic, you're from an Arabic country, you grew up in the Middle East, you speak Arabic, you know about Islam. So what's the real position? Does Islam love the Jews or not? And so do you remember the story, by the way, from the
Yeah, of
person?
course, of course.
So then I said, okay, let me, rather than start quoting her a million things, why don't I share with her a montage, which, by the way, I shared this montage very recently on my X feed, maybe 3 months ago. So there's a montage of, I think it's about 20 something minutes of imams, journalists, writers, children, all sorts of folks from the noble lands of perpetual peace speaking about their views of the Jews. Now, these are imams from very, very prestigious mosques and Islamic learning centers and Al Azhar University and so on, right? And their positions on the Jews were not very friendly, right? So that would be hopefully devastating information that might contradict what her friend said, which is no, 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 Islam loves the Jews. The Jewish student wrote back to me subsequent to me simply sharing that montage with her. And she said, by the way, I still have those emails. I never get rid of those emails, so I can go back to it and marvel at her wood crookedness. Uh, and she said, "You are no different in your extremism than they are." So, them explaining how, for example, so in Arabic, there are these lamentation, Lesh ya Allah, Lesh ya Allah, why God, right? So there are these lamentations where the noble, peaceful Muslims are showing footage of the Jewish bones in the Holocaust being taken with the bulldozers into the mass graves. And the Imam is lamenting to Allah, why did you not give us this pleasure? Why is it that you made the Nazis have this pleasure and not us, your people, right? So it's a level of evil that's difficult to comprehend for the typical human mind. She didn't think that that was evil. She thought that me sharing that clip made me no different in my extremism. I'm also full of hate by sharing those clips. Well, the point of the story is that about a year ago, that person wrote me an email. And if I can paraphrase what she said, this is her speaking. I was an utter moron and I should have listened to you more carefully. Uh, those aren't
Wow.
those are not the
Wow.
words that she used, but
Yeah.
it's roughly that. So even for someone who was as lost as her, I was able to get through to her. And I've had millions of those stories. So, notwithstanding your friend who wasn't willing to read the book properly, I think that if you approach people with the right persuasion strategies, most are willing to listen to you.
So, as you said a couple of times in our short conversation, you grew up in Lebanon, and believe it or not, Israelis from my generation don't know a Jew could actually grow up in Lebanon. Can you share a little bit what it was like growing up as a Jew there?
Right. So we meaning my immediate family, my nuclear family. It's my father, my mother, and we are four brothers and sisters. I have two brothers and a sister and myself. So we were part of the last remaining group of Jews in Lebanon. Most Jews who had been in Lebanon in the 20th century had already left by the time of the start of the Lebanese Civil War in 75. So my extended family, meaning my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, my grandparents, had all left Israel, Lebanon way before. Most went to Israel, but some went to France, some came to Canada, and so on. So
It's
because
very
they had
rare actually to find in Israel Jews from Lebanon.
it is rare because there aren't too many, but at the maximum point of uh, Jewish life in Lebanon, you had several thousands. As a matter of fact, the the parliament in Lebanon, it's called a confessional parliament, meaning that you assign seats in parliament as a function of the number of people you have of that faith. Uh, the parliament had one seat for Jews
For Jews. Mm,
in Lebanon. And
yeah.
so there has, of course, been Jewish presence in all that region since forever. So we were now my some of my most immediate ancestors are Syrian Jews who left Syria to Lebanon because of some of the difficulties they faced. But my own family had decided to stay in Lebanon, even though my siblings had left Lebanon. So my siblings are much older than me. The youngest one after me is 10 years older, 12 years older, and 14 years older. And they had moved to, my brother had moved to France. One of my brothers, my youngest brother, who's 10 years, the next youngest, who's 10 years older than me, was judo champion of Lebanon for many years in a row. And he had been approached, this is before the Civil War. This is when Lebanon was super peaceful and progressive and tolerant. Uh,
Beirut was called, I think, Paris of the Middle East, right?
right, right. But you should put kind of quotes around that because tolerant in the Middle East has a different meaning than tolerant in the rest of the world, or certainly in the West. So, and now I'm going to give you an example of what tolerance looks like in Lebanon. So, my brother was approached by some men who explained to him that it was time for him to retire because it's a bit shameful for a Jew to be winning these kinds of tournaments all the time. And so, because he wasn't willing to retire, he ended up moving to France, and he did so before the start of the Civil War. My oldest brother decided to leave Lebanon in 1974, so 1 year before the Civil War, because it was also becoming very dangerous for him and his wife. He had married a Palestinian woman, which didn't go too well either with his family or with my family, Palestinian
Oh,
Christian woman. And he had some difficulties with the PLO and so on. And so he also left. And my sister had also moved to Montreal prior to the Civil War. But I was very young. When the Civil War started, I was 10. My parents were there. And so we were going about our business until it was impossible to be in Lebanon. Now, how is it growing up in Lebanon? As I explained in The Parasitic Mind, although I only shared a few
right.
poignant stories, you always knew that trouble could be around the corner. So the first story that I tell about sort of facing Jew hatred in Beirut as a young boy was when Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the president of Egypt, passed away in 1970. I was not quite 6 years old then. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are always these lamentations and screaming in the streets in the Middle East. So people were protesting on the street because he had just died. And the most frequent message being screamed was death to Jews, death to Jews. And I was a bit confused because I didn't understand why they were screaming death to Jews because an Egyptian president had died. So that was my first exposure to what it was like growing up in a Islamic or Arabic country. At the time, Lebanon was not quite Islamic yet. It was actually majority
Mm,
Christian.
yeah.
Uh, the second story I tell in the book is about a year or two before the Civil War started. The teacher had asked us to stand up and tell the class what we want to be when we grow up. And so the usual stuff, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a soccer player, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a policeman. And one kid gets up and says, when I grow up, I want to be a Jew killer. And of course, everybody laughs and claps. Now, that kid knew that I was Jewish, and there was another Jewish kid in the class, but it didn't stop him from expressing what seemed very natural that, when I grow up, I'm going to kill Jews. And so Jew hatred was everywhere. It was even banal, right? If it rained, it's because of the Jews. If, as you know, this is after the Civil War, when Egypt had a bunch of shark attacks in Sharm el-Sheikh, it was because the sharks had been trained by the
By
Zionists,
the Mossad, yeah.
by the Mossad. And so everything in the Middle East is viewed through the prism of the diabolical
Mm,
puppeteering Jew. So
yeah.
yes, it's the Paris of the Middle East, and that yes, on a daily basis, people are not getting killed all over the street before the war. But then something happens, and then it's no longer okay to be Jewish. This is the story for the past 1400 years. So that's my story growing up in Lebanon.
When you see today what's happening in Lebanon, how it makes you feel?
Well, I mean, there are several ways to answer this. One thing is it makes me feel so regretful that I've never been able to share that heritage with my children, right? I greatly regret that I can't go back to Lebanon and see the school where, it's as if this is something that happened to someone else. It's in the back of my mind from 50 years ago, but I would like to go back to where I used to go and buy the cake, where I used to go play soccer. I want to show that to my children. I can't. And regrettably, I don't think it'll ever happen in my lifetime because I truly think that Lebanon is a failed state. It's not only failed because of its religious, you know, problem, identity politics, but also the corruption is unbelievable, right? People's entire savings disappear, and you can no longer go to the bank. You've spent your life, saving all your money, and you no longer have access to it. So, I it hurts my heart because I always think that if the Middle East were to free itself of all of that craziness, it is so filled with history. By definition, it really is the cradle of civilization. It is filled with such beautiful cultural values, hospitality, warmth, uh,
And it's a beautiful country, you know?
beautiful country, the
Yeah.
topography, the beach, the skiing in the mountains, that I would love to be able to share this with my family, but I don't think it will happen.
As we say in the Middle East, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Um, what's very interesting, I've spoken to some conservative intellectuals, like people like Neil Ferguson and Ayaan
Yes.
Hirsi Ali, who started a new institution, academic institutions, because the old ones they think are too corrupt. In general, the vibe I get from you seems more optimistic when I hear lectures of you. Do you stay where you are today in Montreal because you think there's still something to fix there? And what do you views about how to save the Western academia, let's say?
Yeah, so I don't think that the university in general is irrevocably, on its deathbed,
Hmm.
because most students and most professors still want to go about their business doing good work, enriching their minds. But it doesn't take too many intellectual terrorists to poison the well for the rest of us, right? And the analogy that I draw here is how many bad folks did it take to change the New York City skyline forever? Was it 190 million terrorists? Was it 1.9 billion terrorists? Was it 190,000 terrorists? No, it was 19 terrorists. It only took 19 people to alter the landscape. So you don't need millions of, you know, activists to make the place unbearable. But that doesn't mean that we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Yes, I think the reflex to create new institutions, and by the way, they'll be happy that I'm promoting them now. I was recently at the University of Austin, which is one of the new universities that is being put together.
I've seen
Neil
the lecture, yeah.
Yes, Neil Ferguson is both he and Ayan are good friends of mine. Neil is sits on the board of trustees. I was incredibly impressed with the place. I thought the students were incredibly, you probably listened to the questions.
Yeah.
They they were mature, they were poised, they were well informed. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. I think we can create new institutions from the ground up that have the correct values, but we can also hopefully vaccinate the current universities against the nonsense and reclaim reason. So I think both are possible. I don't think that universities are on their deathbed. I think we can turn it around.
I want to ask about another book you wrote about happiness.
Yes, sir.
From what I've read, researchers distinguish between emotional happiness and happiness through meaning. What do you think are the key factors in achieving happiness in life, and how important is finding meaning in life for being happy?
Yes, great question. If you would have asked me immediately after I finished Parasitic Mind what my next book would be, I would be lying to you if I told you that I was going to write a happiness book. That one sort of came up organically, in part,
As a
in large
reaction,
part.
maybe.
First, yes, the previous book was what happens to minds when they are negatively affected. So it's nice to write a positive book. But it really came from hearing so many people write to me saying, how is it that you can maintain your humor and you're always smiling and you're playful with all of the difficult stuff that you've gone through in your life and all the difficult topics that you deal with. What's your secret, Professor? And so I thought, okay, you know what? Why don't I write a book that explains those secrets? Hence, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. But I was a bit hesitant at first because if you do a cursory overview of probably the topic that has been most written about by ancient philosophers till today, certainly the ancient Greeks, they've already written a lot of stuff about how to live the good life. And so my concern was, can I come up with a book that is truly unique? And I'd like to think I have because I'm taking my unique insights coupled with ancient wisdoms and contemporary science, putting them together to hopefully come up with something fresh and novel. What are some secrets? And regarding your question about meaning, so one of the things that I talk about in the book, early in the book, are the two decisions that you make that can either impart the most amount of happiness or regrettably the most amount of misery to your life, and that is choosing the right spouse and choosing the right profession. And the meaning part comes from the profession. So let me address that part. So I argue that all other things equal, to the extent that it's possible to do so, anything that allows you to instantiate your creative impulse will give you purpose and meaning, and hence will lead to, if you like, existential happiness. Because now, what does it mean to instantiate your creative impulse? A stand up comic is being creative because he's creating a unique set of jokes that didn't exist until he created them, that hopefully are going to make members of the audience happy. A chef is creating something new. An architect is creating something new. An author and professor is creating something new. So there are many, many ways by which I can satisfy my creative instinct, but doing so immediately immerses me in meaning and purpose, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need bus drivers and that their lives are not valuable. And it doesn't mean that insurance adjusters are also not important and accountants. But very few people wake up in the morning and say, I am existentially happy and satisfied because I am a accountant and an insurance adjuster. That just becomes a job that I have to do to pursue other interests. But if your job itself can be a form of play, can be a creative lab of creation and innovation, then you've really hit the jackpot. And so one of the reasons why I'm happy every day, other than, by the way, I should mention, and I mentioned this early in the book, about 50% of individual differences in happiness stem from our genes. But that still leaves about
It's
50%
depressing a
that's,
bit.
well, no, it depends if you look at it as half full or half empty. If 50% of our happiness is inscribed in our genes, that still leaves 50%
50% for us,
within
yeah.
our, right. So I could be born with a sunny disposition and you're born with a sullen disposition. That puts me ahead in the game. But then I could make all the wrong decisions and adopt all the wrong mindsets, and you do the opposite, and suddenly you get to the top of Mount Happiness much quicker than I do.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's really depressing. I think it's actually a message of empowerment. And so I mentioned earlier, I mean, I can go through all of the prescriptions, but maybe I'll mention one or two. Live life as though it's a playground. It sounds like a cliche and banal, but it really isn't because I'm constantly in a playful mood. By the way, I get more people coming up to me in the street who recognize me, who refer to something humorous that I've done more than all of my fancy professorial stuff. Why? Because people bond with humor. That's why I explain always that dictators, they don't get rid of guys who are tall with big muscles first because those are easy to get rid of. They get rid of the ones who have sharp tongues, the ones who write with poisonous pens, the humorists, the satirists, because they're the ones who serve as an existential threat to my power. I need to, and hence that's why you say this, the pen is mightier than the sword. So using satire, using sarcasm, using humor, uh, by the way, I was recently, well, I'm often told by people, don't you think though that your humor takes away from sort of your professorial authority? Absolutely not. It's the
Hmm.
exact opposite. As a matter of fact, it's precisely because I am so self-confident about my personhood that I could wear the pink wig
Yeah.
and make fun of the idiots. If I were insecure, that's when I would have to put on the air of the fancy professor smoking a pipe and looking into the air and
Yeah.
looking down on people. But it's precisely because, notwithstanding all of my fancy degrees, I'm just a regular guy who's a professor of the people. That's why I resonate with people. So the people who tell me, why do you use humor? It diminishes you, are imbeciles. They're wood crickets.
And if we started with the biggest question of them all, how has Professor Saad dodged cancel culture after openly mocking wokeness and postmodernism? Maybe humor is one of the answers. I think
That's
so.
exactly right. It so there are several ways to look at that. First of all, it's hard to dislike someone who has a warm disposition. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who dislike me for all sorts of reasons. There are many, many haters, but I'm not sullen. I'm not cantankerous. I'm warm. Not recently, this was a few years ago. There was someone who was interviewing me on their show, and at the end of the show, I can't remember if it was offline or online. He looked at me, he goes, you know, Gad, I'm very upset at you. I said, why? He goes, because I had every intention of disliking you by the end of this conversation. And God damn it, I really like you. And so, and so
Wait,
I
wait to the offline what you're gonna say to you. Okay.
exactly. So I think using humor, not taking yourself seriously, people who truly read my message know that I'm filled with zero hate. I attack ideas. I harbor no hatred towards individuals. That's what, and plus I'm always armed with the right facts, right? You could never catch me in a moment where I said something where I half-assed it because I'm very well disciplined to never say something with authority unless I've got a tsunami of evidence backing me.
Yes,
Therefore,
it's
you
chapter
can
7 in
exactly very
Parasitic
good.
Mind. Yeah, I read
Exactly.
it. God, I read it really. One question that fascinates me, we've been talking about the meaning of the individual, and let's wrap it all up and talk about the decline of the West. So let's talk about the maybe problem of meaning in the West. So one question that fascinates me is whether the West will need to return to religion in order to survive. Take, for example, a person like Jonathan Rauch. For example, he's an atheist and liberal who's written about happiness too. But now he sees the decline of Christianity in public life as a major factor in the erosion of social cohesion in America. And as a gay Jewish liberal, he now supports the return of religion to the public life in the United States. What do you think about this shift among liberals and state of the West in general?
Specifically as relating to the presence or absence of religion
Yeah,
or
yeah,
uh, so in a sense, we briefly touched on this earlier in our
right.
conversation. Uh, I don't like the idea of saying that the only way for people to find purpose, meaning, solace is only through religion. I fully understand, as I mentioned earlier, the reflex to do so, and more power to you, as long as in the pursuit of your religiosity, you never infringe 1 millimeter on the right of another.
But now you're talking again about the individual, okay? In the individual level, I can understand, but when I'm talking about the clash of civilizations, let's say between the secular West to Islam, and I see the Islamic populations filled with very strong identity, very strong religion. I see the secular West with no such thing. And in the core of civilization, even the West, we need to find the religious core,
Impulse. Yeah.
yeah, impulse. So it's
Uh,
different from the
I,
individual level.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier Ayan Hirsi Ali. She would
Right.
agree exactly with you, right? Because
Yeah.
she she left Islam, went to atheism, and then realized that pragmatically speaking, to call people to atheism becomes a lot more difficult when combating, a supremacist religion that wants to take over. And therefore, she kind of argued, I don't mean to put words in her mouth, but maybe an easier jump is to go to, let's say, Christianity, because you replace one belief system with another. So again, I understand.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I understand that reflex, and I can understand it pragmatically. But again, being a purist, it disappoints me that that would be the only way to do so. Reason could also be what bonds us together. Science could also be. Uh, an earthly appartenance to Judaism could do that. So, as I said, I'm very, very Jewish without necessarily thinking that whether I wear a kippah or not is the means of expressing my Jewish. So, I fully understand that reflex and I get it. I'd like to think, though, that that's not the only way for us to combat ideologies that are contrary to our values. So, for example, communism was also once a very dangerous ideology. We didn't need necessarily Judeo-Christianity to combat it. Capitalism, in this case, was a system that proved to be superior in allowing the maximal flourishing of individuals. So, yes, I get the reflex that fighting one religion is probably easiest to do via another religion, but it's certainly not the only way.
Last question about Israel as a role model for the West. So we started with October 7th, and for the first time, this is my thoughts. I believe that Israeli society has found a nearly maybe universal role to be something like a role model for the West of a functional society with tradition, with big families, with good economy. You know, it has its problems, of course. But unlike the West, it doesn't seem to have the same deep patterns of decline if talking about all of elites being woke, you know. Do you think I'm exaggerating, or can you see it in this lens?
So I recently had several chats with the Israeli hosts, uh,
Gadi
Gadi,
Taub, Ariel Whiteman, or
exactly,
Yosevich,
Ariel,
yeah.
and exactly, and I think in several of those conversations, I think certainly with Ariel, if I'm not mistaken, he asked, what is it that makes Israelis probably less susceptible to succumbing to the parasitic ideas. Although I did explain that at the university level, you have a lot of wood cricket professors who are Israelis. But my answer, which I'll repeat here, is it's a lot less likely for people to fall prey to gigantic imbecility when you are in the neighborhood of Israel, right? So in my daily reality of being an Israeli where I don't know who's going to come at me from which corner, I don't have the luxury to spend my time discussing whether some women have 9-inch penises, right? And therefore, there is an inherent inoculation against parasitic ideas by virtue of me being in a very dangerous neighborhood, right? So that reality slaps me into not adopting these, nonsensical ideas. And this is, I draw an analogy here with anorexia nervosa. So, anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder that historically is only found in societies of plentitude, meaning it is only in societies where you don't have to worry about truly facing endemic famine that you can afford the luxury of being anorexic. You don't have many anorexic women in Ethiopia, but you have them in some places in ancient Greece where there was plenitude, and you have them in the West. You don't have them in places where you have famine. I think that's the exact same mechanism that explains why Israelis don't fall prey to the stupidity, because they're too busy running into the bomb shelters to protect their children.
So it's less bombastic as I as I say, phrase it, but yeah, it's still something. Professor Gad Saad, thank you very much. When you're coming to Israel?
Well,
Soon, I
it's
hope.
I hope so too. Look, I was recently invited to come to do a tour, which I'm very, very excited to do. It's just very hard for me now because of all of my scheduling conflicts. So now we've changed it from this spring to hopefully, inshallah, next fall. And hopefully I'll
Inshallah.
get to meet you in person.
Okay, so see you there, inshallah. And well, I'd like to say in Arabic, نورت المحل. Really, it was a pleasure. يعطيك العافية. And
شكرا
see you.
حبيبي. شكرا.
Shukran. Thank you very much. Goodbye.